It was a crisp spring morning in Boise, Idaho, 1973. The kind of morning where the sun rose slowly over the rolling hills, casting long shadows across the orchards and neighborhoods that line the Snake River. Birds called intermittently from the budding trees, their songs punctuating the quiet streets. In the quiet of the suburbs, houses hummed softly with the ordinary routines of families preparing for the day. Windows were open to let in the fresh air, breakfast smells drifted through kitchens, and the town seemed entirely unremarkable. Yet beneath this calm, a tension simmered, invisible to the casual observer. 14-year-old Claire Whitman had lived her entire life in Boise, a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else, where streets twisted predictably and neighbors greeted one another by name. She was small but sturdy, with chestnut hair that tumbled in loose waves past her shoulders, bright hazel eyes that carried both curiosity and mischief, and a smile that lit up every room she entered. Claire had been studious but not obsessive, adventurous but careful, and fiercely loyal to her circle of friends. She loved riding her bicycle along the quiet lanes near the river, sketching in her notebook, and helping her mother in the garden. On the morning of May 12th, Claire kissed her mother Ellen on the cheek and stepped out into the bright, warming sunlight. She wore a pale yellow blouse and denim skirt, her sneakers scuffed from the last week's explorations along the riverbank. Claire had promised to return by noon to help set up for her younger brother's birthday party. She carried her sketchbook, a small satchel, and an eager sense of independence. Her mother watched across the street, unaware that this routine departure would be the last time she saw her daughter. Claire's route was simple, but it was a path she had taken countless times before. She pedaled past neighbors' houses, waved at friends walking to school, and cut to a small park where trees were beginning to bloom. The air smelled of grass, earth, and the faint aroma of baked bread from a nearby bakery. Birds darted in the branches overhead, and a soft wind tugged at her skirt and hair. It was an ordinary morning, one that bore no hint of the extraordinary tragedy about to unfold. By late morning, when Claire had not returned, her mother's anxiety began to swell. At first, Ellen assumed her daughter had lingered with friends or become absorbed in her sketching along the river. She called out from a porch, peered down streets, and checked familiar haunts, but there was no response. Panic began to creep into her chest like a cold, unwelcome shadow. The minutes stretched into an hour, each tick clock amplifying a growing sense of dread. Neighbors noticed Ellen's distress and gathered instinctively. Harold Thompson, a retired schoolteacher living across the street, offered to search the nearby park. Children were asked where they had last seen Claire, and everyone's attention sharpened. The suburban streets that had felt safe and predictable now seemed strange, hostile even. Every rustling bush, every moving car, and every passerby became a potential source of concern. The sense of security that had always defined Boise's tight-knit community was unraveling thread by thread. By mid-afternoon, Claire's absence had become undeniable. The police were called, and officers quickly arrived to take statements and organize a search. Patrols fanned out across neighborhoods, to the orchard-lined roads, and along the riverbanks, flashing lights cutting across the warm afternoon sun. Flyers were printed hastily. Photographs of Claire, descriptions of her clothing, and pleas for information. Her hazel eyes stared back from every window, every bulletin board, every storefront, a silent reminder of the urgency and fear that now gripped the town. Local media arrived soon after, covering the story with a mix of caution and sensationalism. The headlines were stark. Boise teen missing, community on edge, and 14-year-old girl vanishes near Snake River. Reporters interviewed neighbors, teachers, and friends, documenting the collective anxiety that had settled over the city. The more the story spread, the more residents watched and waited, each moment stretching the tension across homes, schools, and workplaces. Even those who did not know Claire personally felt the ache of uncertainty, the creeping fear that a stranger had violated the peaceful rhythms of their community. Initial search efforts were organized with precision. Officers Green and Marlowe, assigned to the case, led teams along logical routes, riverbanks, playgrounds, and wooded areas near the outskirts of Boise. Volunteer neighbors scoured underbrush, calling her name, waving hands in the air to signal their presence. Bloodhounds traced scents that twisted through grass and along gravel paths, only to lose the trail after a few hundred feet. The early afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hills, painting the town in streaks of light and dark, emphasizing both the beauty of the setting and the horror of the uncertainty. By nightfall, Claire's absence had transitioned from worrying to alarming. The community gathered at the local high school gymnasium, transformed into a temporary command center for volunteers and family members. Maps were spread across tables, photographs pinned to boards, and lists of search areas updated continuously. Phones rang constantly as neighbors reported potential sightings. Strangers asked for information, and police coordinated with other departments in surrounding towns. The sense of urgency was palpable, almost tactile, like a current running through every interaction and glance. Claire's family sat together in stunned silence, holding one another for comfort that felt insufficient against the weight of their fear. Ellen Parker's hand shook as she clutched Claire's sketchbook, her tears leaving smudges on the pencil sketches that now seemed unbearably precious. Her husband, Robert Whitman, paced, muttering reassurances he didn't entirely believe, his eyes scanning every corner of the gymnasium, every map, every volunteer. The community's hope and despair became intertwined, feeding on one another in a delicate balance that could tip at any moment. The first night ended with no answers. Search parties returned with empty hands, volunteers exhausted but resolute, and the Parker family retreating home with the gnawing knowledge that the world they had known had shifted irrevocably. Boise, which had once been calm and predictable, had become a town suspended between memory and fear, where every shadow might conceal a clue and every stranger might be a threat. Claire Whitman's disappearance had created a wound that would ripple through the town for decades, shaping not only the investigation, but the very consciousness of a community that refused to forget. The morning after Claire Whitman's disappearance, Boise awoke to a tension that was impossible to ignore. The usual sounds of children playing, bicycles clattering along sidewalks, and neighbors greeting one another were overshadowed by whispers and anxious glances. The air felt charged, as though the city itself sensed the presence of something unseen, something sinister that had stepped into its quiet routines. Families checked locks and doors with renewed urgency. Parents kept a closer eye on their children, and even familiar streets felt unfamiliar, fraught with possibility and fear. Claire's parents were the first to report her missing officially. Ellen Whitman recounted the morning events in meticulous detail. Claire leaving for her bicycle ride, the promise to return by noon, the weight of her satchel, the way the sunlight caught her hair as she pedaled away. Officers Green and Marlowe took notes carefully, their faces a mask of professional concern, knowing that every detail, time, clothing, route, could prove crucial. They asked questions they had asked 100 times before in other missing person cases. Had she argued with anyone recently? Did she have a secret rendezvous? Were there strangers in the neighborhood? Ellen answered honestly, her voice trembling, but there were no answers that could explain her daughter's sudden absence. Schoolmates and neighbors were interviewed immediately. Friends reported that Claire had seemed cheerful that morning, joking about a new sketch she had drawn, humming quietly as she walked to her bike. No one had seen her encounter anyone suspicious. No one recalled an unusual car or stranger in the vicinity. Yet subtle recollections began to surface. A fleeting shadow near the river, a figure that had been noticed by someone walking a dog, a car parked oddly along the route. None of these were concrete, but they planted seeds of suspicion that would grow over the coming days. By mid-morning, the first organized search began. Volunteers, parents, neighbors, even teenagers fanned out across Boise, scouring parks, wooded areas, and streets, calling Claire's name. Officers directed the search methodically, coordinating zones to avoid duplication and ensure maximum coverage. The volunteers moved through the orchards lining the Snake River with an intensity that combined desperation and resolve. Every rustling branch, every movement in the underbrush, every glint of sunlight on metal or glass was scrutinized. The hope of finding Claire alive pushed exhaustion aside, at least for those first frantic hours. The police also initiated a door-to-door inquiry. Officers knocked on every house within a 5-mile radius of Claire's home, asking residents if they had seen or heard anything unusual. Some neighbors reported nothing. Others offered fleeting impressions, such as hearing a scream or seeing a car parked near the park earlier in the morning. Officers Green and Marlowe jotted down every observation, knowing that even seemingly insignificant details might later prove pivotal. The process was painstaking, repetitive, and emotionally taxing, but there was no alternative. Every stone had to be turned, every lead investigated. Local media coverage escalated quickly. Newspapers and radio stations broadcast Claire's disappearance, showing her photograph repeatedly and requesting that anyone with information come forward. Headlines painted a mix of urgency and alarm. Boise teen missing, community on edge, and parents plead for daughter's return. Stories highlighted Claire's personality, her love of art, her gentle humor, and her reliability, emphasizing how unusual it was for someone so responsible to vanish without a trace. The coverage fueled both hope and fear. The broader community, even those who did not know Claire personally, felt an uneasy connection to her disappearance. As the day wore on, volunteers and officers expanded the search to the Snake River itself. Canoes and small boats scanned the banks, while officers walked along the shorelines, peering into reeds and undergrowth. Bloodhounds were brought in from neighboring counties, their noses tracing faint, intermittent scents that twisted through grass and dirt before dissipating. Every clue was documented, every potential lead meticulously logged, yet the river yielded nothing concrete. Claire's trail seemed to vanish, as though the earth itself had swallowed her presence. By late afternoon, the community began to grasp the gravity of the situation. Ellen and Robert Whitman were distraught but resolute, organizing small groups of volunteers, answering media inquiries, and staying in constant contact with law enforcement. The city seemed to shrink around them, every familiar street and park imbued with anxiety. Residents held impromptu meetings, strategized search routes, and shared reports of suspicious sightings. The energy of fear and determination rippled outward, touching everyone in Boise, creating a collective consciousness that focused intensely on one shared, horrifying reality. Claire Whitman was missing. Initial witness reports brought brief flashes of hope. A jogger claimed to have seen a girl resembling Claire near the outskirts of the park around 10:30 a.m., but by the time volunteers arrived, she had vanished. Another neighbor reported a man in a brown truck who had parked near the river and appeared to watch the children playing earlier that morning. Officers followed up on each tip immediately, interviewing individuals, checking records, and comparing timelines. While none of these reports produced definitive evidence, they kept the search alive and the community engaged. As evening fell, the search parties returned to central coordination points, exhausted, muddy, and emotionally frayed. Officers Green and Marlowe reviewed maps, notes, and witness statements, realizing that the case would require methodical, ongoing investigation, not just initial urgency. The absence of concrete evidence, combined with the fleeting nature of tips, underscored the difficulty of piecing together events from a morning that had otherwise appeared ordinary. Each detail mattered, yet clarity remained elusive. The first night without Claire was long and haunting. Ellen Whitman sat in the living room, holding Claire's sketchbook to her chest, staring at the pages as if they might somehow guide her daughter back. Robert Whitman walked the streets in circles, scanning shadows, replaying every interaction of the morning, questioning whether a different decision, walking her route together, checking the park more closely, could have prevented this nightmare. The city slept fitfully, haunted by uncertainty, every whisper of wind or creak of a branch sounding like a signal, a clue, or threat. By the next morning, Boise had collectively stepped into a state of vigilant mourning. Flyers were distributed to neighboring towns. Radio announcements repeated Claire's description, and law enforcement expanded coordination to surrounding counties. The mayor issued a statement, urging calm but emphasizing the seriousness of the situation, reminding citizens that any detail, no matter how small, could be vital. Parents kept their children close. Strangers were regarded with suspicion, and the town, once unremarkable, now pulsed with tension, anticipation, and fear. The disappearance of Claire Whitman had transformed Boise overnight. The ordinary streets, orchards, and parks became sites of vigilance, anxiety, and relentless hope. Each neighbor, volunteer, and officer carried the weight of responsibility, knowing that the fate of one child had become a test of the community's cohesion, perseverance, and courage. And while the hours stretched into days, the question that haunted everyone remained the same. Was Claire Whitman, and what had happened on that ordinary spring morning that had shattered the ordinary world they all had known. The Whitman family's grief was immediate, raw, and all-encompassing. Ellen Whitman could barely speak without breaking into tears, her mind cycling endlessly through images of Claire leaving for a bicycle ride, imagining the laughter that would never return, and wondering what could have gone so terribly wrong. Robert Whitman, normally stoic and calm, was a bundle of nerves, pacing their small Boise home in long, rigid strides, muttering instructions to neighbors, planning search routes, and replaying every morning interaction for clues. Their home, once a place of comfort and routine, had transformed overnight into a command center of worry, letters, phone calls, and frantic activity. Neighbors and friends rallied quickly. The close-knit community that Boise had always been now became a network of vigilance. Housewives, retirees, and teenagers joined in search parties that fanned out in every direction, from the orchards along the Snake River to the shaded parks and empty lots where children played. Posters with Claire's smiling face and a description of her clothing were posted on telephone poles, store windows, and mailboxes, ensuring that the sight of her image became omnipresent throughout the city. Even strangers passing through were urged to report any potential sightings. The city itself had become an active participant in the search, mobilized by both fear and empathy. Local schools responded by holding assemblies and meetings, emphasizing caution, attentiveness, and the importance of community action. Teachers encouraged students to share any information they might have, no matter how insignificant it seemed, while also offering reassurance to children whose sense of security had been shaken. Classrooms were heavy with whispers, the energy of anxious curiosity and concern palpable. In the corridors, students shared rumors, speculations, and fragments of observations, creating a tapestry of collective memory that both helped and hindered investigators. The city's religious institutions also became centers of support. Churches held prayer vigils, candlelight services, and community gatherings. Congregations prayed not only for Claire's safe return, but also for the Whitman family's strength, the volunteers' endurance, and the guidance of law enforcement. In these spaces, parents found solidarity. Neighbors found shared purpose. The spiritual dimension of the crisis reinforced the town's resolve, emphasizing that Claire's disappearance was not just a family tragedy, but a communal one. Meanwhile, law enforcement faced mounting pressure. Officers Green and Marlowe were inundated with calls, tips, and sightings from concerned citizens. Each lead had to be verified painstakingly, a process complicated by the high volume of information and the emotional stakes for everyone involved. Some tips were promising. Reports of a girl matching Claire's description on the outskirts of town or near the river, but each ended in disappointment. Yet Green remained methodical, knowing that every misstep could mean a lost opportunity. He often returned home late at night, exhausted but relentless, reviewing notes, plotting search grids, and preparing for the next day's investigations. For the Whitman family, the emotional toll was relentless. Ellen barely slept, waking at odd hours to check locks, peek outside, and imagine every possible scenario that could explain her daughter's absence. She spoke with reporters, not just to share Claire's image, but to plead for vigilance, for attention, for awareness. Her voice, often shaking, carried the weight of desperation and hope intertwined. Robert, meanwhile, worked closely with volunteers, coordinating searches and ensuring that all areas were thoroughly examined. The couple's commitment to finding their daughter became both a coping mechanism and a public call to action, inspiring others to contribute time, energy, and attention to the search. As days stretched into a week, the community organized more formal search efforts. Local police joined forces with neighboring departments, mapping grids, scheduling patrols, and assigning volunteers to specific areas. Canoes scoured the Snake River. Search dogs combed wooded areas, and rooftop surveillance covered areas overlooked from the ground. Each new method, each fresh sweep, carried the hope that Claire's trail could still be found. Posters were updated daily with the latest information, her photograph now accompanied by sketches of likely routes, last known locations, and a plea for any sightings or tips, no matter how minor. Media coverage amplified the emotional pressure and communal engagement. Newspapers ran updates on the search. Radio broadcasts repeated pleas for information, and television stations provided on-the-ground footage of volunteers combing the riverbanks and parks. Interviews with neighbors, classmates, and family members humanized the story, emphasizing Claire's personality, her kindness, and her absence in a way that made the entire city feel her loss. Public response was overwhelming. Donations, volunteer hours, and information poured in from across the region. It became clear that the disappearance had transcended the family alone, impacting Boise at a civic, emotional, and psychological level. Rumors began to spread, as they always do in the absence of certainty. Some speculated that Claire had been kidnapped by someone she knew. Others suggested a stranger had lured her near the river. Every story, no matter how improbable, was evaluated, cross-referenced, and either confirmed or dismissed. These circulating narratives heightened anxiety, but also drove action, reinforcing the sense that vigilance was necessary, that nothing could be ignored. The Whitmans had to navigate these swirling stories carefully, discerning credible leads from baseless speculation while maintaining their own fragile hope. Neighbors held late-night meetings, strategizing over maps and photos, dividing areas into sections for volunteers to patrol the next morning. Each day blurred into the next as sleep, food, and personal obligations became secondary to pursuit of information. The sense of urgency and shared responsibility was intoxicating but exhausting, creating bonds among community members that would endure long after the immediate crisis had passed. In these collective efforts, Boise transformed from a quiet city into a town mobilized by grief, determination, and hope. By the end of the second week, fatigue set in, but so did a deeper resolve. The Whitmans, Officers Green and Marlowe, and the volunteers recognized that time could not halt their search. Instead, persistence became the driving force. Plans were refined, search areas adjusted, and every report was meticulously logged. Though immediate results were sparse, the process of vigilance reinforced the idea that every citizen had a role, and that Claire's safe return or the discovery of her fate depended upon sustained, focused effort. Throughout it all, the emotional currents remained unbroken. Ellen and Robert Whitman's despair was tempered by small signs of hope. A fleeting sighting that almost matched Claire's description, a volunteer's report of a bicycle left along a river trail, or a hunch that seemed worth pursuing. The community, in turn, shared their own anxieties and hopes, creating a tapestry of collective concern that strengthened bonds and heightened awareness. In these days, weeks, and months, the disappearance of Claire Whitman became not only a family tragedy, but a civic mission, binding Boise together through grief, determination, and the unrelenting search for truth. And yet, beneath the community mobilization and tireless searching, an unsettling realization began to take hold. The evidence, the tips, and the sightings offered glimpses but no certainty. Claire had vanished completely, leaving only traces, memories, and a profound absence. The city that had mobilized with extraordinary speed and energy was left to confront a chilling possibility. The world they had known could not simply be restored, and the days ahead would demand patience, vigilance, and courage as the investigation continued. The investigation into Claire Whitman's disappearance quickly evolved into one of the most complex cases Boise law enforcement had faced in decades. Officers Green and Marlowe coordinated meticulously, juggling volunteer reports, witness statements, and early tips from concerned residents. Every lead was cataloged, cross-referenced, and examined with painstaking care. Yet despite the citywide mobilization, the trail remained frustratingly cold. Early suspicion naturally fell on those closest to Claire. Friends, acquaintances, and even neighbors were interviewed repeatedly. Investigators examined her recent interactions for any sign of conflict, jealousy, or quarrels that might suggest a voluntary disappearance or foul play. Classmates remembered nothing alarming. Teachers confirmed her cheerful demeanor. Neighbors offered routine observations of a girl who had always been careful yet adventurous. The investigation turned up nothing that could explain her sudden vanishing, leaving police with more questions than answers. A handful of reports initially seemed promising. A man driving a brown pickup truck had been seen near the park around 10:30 a.m., according to a neighbor's recollection. Officers followed up immediately, checking local registration records, interviewing men with similar vehicles, and canvassing neighborhoods. Each potential lead ended in frustration, either because the sighting was mistaken, the person had a solid alibi, or the trail simply went cold. Each dead end intensified the anxiety within the Whitman family and the community at large. The search extended to the Snake River, where some believe Claire may have fallen or been taken. Canoes scoured the waterway, Officers walked along the banks, and dogs tracked scent lines that began but ended abruptly. Forensic evidence was minimal. Scuffed tire tracks along a gravel road, a faint footprint in mud that could have been a neighbor's child, and the occasional item of lost clothing that proved unrelated. Each day, volunteers returned with tired bodies and heavy hearts, carrying the same mix of hope and disappointment. Media coverage fueled public interest and pressure on the investigators. Newspapers and radio updates highlighted every new detail, speculative or confirmed. With the town watching closely, Green and Marlowe had to navigate both the practicalities of the search and the growing weight of community expectation. Tips poured in from Boise residents and even from neighboring cities, but many were false leads, misidentifications, pranks, or entirely unrelated reports that distracted resources and energy. The officers had to maintain focus, distinguishing what could be actionable from what merely fed fear. Weeks passed with no breakthrough. The brown truck lead had led nowhere. Anonymous tips suggested the involvement of transit workers or strangers in town, but follow-up interviews revealed no connections. Several minor arrests were made for unrelated criminal activity near Claire's last known locations, only to be eliminated as possibilities once alibis were verified. The police faced a paradox. The more they investigated, the more evidence they needed, yet the case itself offered little beyond the empty trail Claire had left behind. The Whitman family's anguish deepened with each unproductive search. Ellen Whitman would walk the neighborhoods in the evenings, calling her daughter's name into alleys and across streets, listening for responses that never came. Robert Whitman spent hours coordinating volunteers, poring over maps, and retracing Claire's route, attempting to identify missed opportunities. They began to fear the worst, yet they refused to let despair silence their determination. Every day without a lead hardened their resolve. Every dead end became a challenge to overcome. Several local youths who had interacted with Claire were interviewed multiple times. Some remembered casual conversations. Others reported vague suspicions of a stranger loitering near the park in the preceding weeks. Investigators explored these possibilities carefully, questioning strangers passing through town, transit workers at the nearby factories, and even people passing through from other states. Nothing yielded concrete evidence, and frustration grew. Green, typically methodical, admitted in private that the case might be the most difficult of his career. He feared that unless a tangible lead emerged, the town could be left with only speculation and grief. A turning point seemed near when a witness reported a man seen near the outskirts of town with a large satchel the day of Claire's disappearance. Officers followed up, interviewing men with access to similar bags or seen in the vicinity. Each interview produced no connection, but the tip reinforced the possibility of premeditation. Claire had not wandered randomly into trouble. Someone had been there, observing, waiting. Investigators realized the abduction might have been targeted, a chilling insight that intensified their urgency. Over the following months, false leads continued to dominate. Reports of potential sightings from distant towns were tracked meticulously. Local bars, diners, and gas stations were canvassed for anyone who might have seen a young girl resembling Claire. Each day, officers and volunteers meticulously recorded and cross-referenced details, eliminating impossibilities, building timelines, and attempting to identify patterns. The case evolved into a slow-burning investigation, where patience and persistence became just as critical as speed and action. Despite frustration, the community remained engaged. Volunteers kept search areas monitored, neighbors remained vigilant, and the Whitman family continued to push for attention, creating pressure that kept the investigation alive. Police meetings often ran late into the night, as Green, Marlowe, and their teams debated which leads to prioritize, how to manage limited resources, and how to maintain the integrity of the search amidst misinformation and public pressure. By the end of 1973, the investigation had produced a comprehensive record of Claire's last known movements, witness statements, and exhaustive searches. However, the trail had gone cold. Each lead had been exhausted. Each tip either disproved or ended in ambiguity. The case entered what would later become the first of many years in limbo. In official reports, Claire Whitman's disappearance was classified as an unresolved abduction with strong suspicion of foul play. While the Whitmans and the community clung to hope, the reality settled in. without concrete evidence, the story might never be resolved. In the years that followed, the city of Boise maintained a quiet vigilance. Police records were meticulously preserved, tips archived, and volunteer networks encouraged to stay alert. Even as Claire's disappearance faded from daily headlines, it never left public consciousness. Families spoke of it quietly, reminders of the fragility of safety and the need for attentiveness. The memory of Claire Whitman persisted as a specter hovering over familiar streets, parks, and neighborhoods, a reminder that justice sometimes sleeps, and that truth may remain hidden beneath years of silence and uncertainty. The investigation's false leads, while frustrating, were not without purpose. They kept the community engaged, maintained pressure on law enforcement, and preserved the memory of Claire's existence. Each misstep, each dead end, each misidentified sighting served as a reminder that the case demanded persistence and that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, required patient pursuit. In the end, it was this patience, this meticulous preservation of evidence, and the tireless documentation of every possible detail that would lay the groundwork for the breakthrough that would shock Boise decades later. As the years passed, the Claire Whitman case became a fixture in Boise's collective memory, a wound that refused to heal but one that demanded quiet endurance. Investigators archived every piece of evidence meticulously. Witness statements, photographs, search maps, and crime scene sketches were stored in cabinets and filing rooms at the Boise Police Department. Every scrap of information was preserved, knowing that someday, technology or circumstance might allow a breakthrough that eluded those who had chased leads in 1973. Physical evidence was limited but carefully maintained. Items found near Claire's last known locations, a discarded glove, a small scrap of fabric, and a flattened bicycle tire, were cataloged, bagged, and stored in climate-controlled conditions. For decades, they sat largely untouched, a silent testament to the painstaking diligence of Green, Marlowe, and their colleagues, who recognized that even a minor detail might one day unravel the case. The same applied to photographs taken during searches, sketches of potential suspects, and logs of volunteer sightings. Every document, every note, was a thread waiting to be pulled. The Whitman family aged alongside the case. Ellen and Robert Whitman, once young parents swept into crisis, now became older, quieter figures in the city's social landscape. They continued to speak at gatherings, encourage public vigilance, and maintain the hope that Claire's fate might eventually be revealed. They preserved her sketches, photographs, and personal belongings as if time itself could sustain her memory. Their dedication to truth, unwavering despite decades of uncertainty, became a cornerstone of the community's ongoing attention to the case. Law enforcement faced inevitable turnover. Officers Green and Marlowe eventually retired, leaving behind detailed notes, logs, and insights into the early investigation. Younger detectives assumed responsibility, reviewing decades-old evidence with fresh eyes, understanding that even old cases could yield new leads. The transition required careful preservation of institutional memory, and the Boise Police Department ensured that the Whitman files were never lost, never neglected. They recognized that the passage of time did not erase responsibility. It only made the eventual discovery more poignant. During the 1980s and 1990s, the case remained largely dormant in the public eye. The city continued to speak of Claire Whitman's disappearance with reverence and sadness, but active investigation slowed. New criminal cases, resources, and priorities drew attention elsewhere. Yet within the police archives, the case remained active in a technical sense, noted as a cold case requiring attention when technology or circumstances allowed. Analysts periodically reviewed the material, cross-referencing old leads with newer databases, but no concrete breakthroughs emerged. The first glimmer of hope came in the late 1990s with the advent of DNA technology. Forensic scientists realized that items collected in the 1970s, fabric scraps, a glove, and hair samples, might now yield information impossible to obtain at the time of the disappearance. Police submitted the items to state laboratories, where they were carefully examined using methods unavailable to Green and Marlowe decades earlier. The process was painstaking. DNA extraction was delicate, and contamination over time complicated analysis. Yet the effort marked a turning point. The case, frozen for more than 25 years, could finally be revisited with the tools of modern science. By the early 2000s, advances in forensic databases allowed investigators to cross-reference DNA profiles from the evidence against a growing collection of criminal profiles nationwide. Analysts discovered previously unnoticed correlations, subtle indicators that might have gone undetected in earlier investigations. Every report, every archive note, every photograph was scrutinized for overlooked connections, handwriting comparisons, vehicle sketches, witness timelines. Slowly, the cold case began to thaw, revealing a faint but discernible path toward resolution. During this period, the Whitman family remained engaged, offering support to investigators and keeping the story alive in the public consciousness. Local media occasionally revisited the case, reporting that new technology might provide answers and urging residents to report any recollections from decades earlier. For the community, this was a delicate balance. Hope tempered by years of waiting, vigilance mingled with the ache of remembering a vanished child. Yet the message was clear. Claire Whitman's story, though long paused, was not forgotten. In 2008, a breakthrough emerged when a hair found near Claire's last known route yielded a viable DNA sample. Forensic analysts compared it against the national database, revealing a potential suspect who had been previously overlooked due to lack of evidence. This discovery did not immediately solve the case, but it created a tangible lead, a thread that could be followed with focused investigation. Detectives re-examined witness statements, re-interviewed neighbors, and scrutinized every detail in the light of this new information. The dormant case had found its spark. The renewed investigation required delicate handling. Many of the original witnesses were elderly, memories faded or altered by decades. Investigators approached each interview carefully, corroborating statements with archive materials and forensic data. Every new revelation was cross-checked, every claim verified, and every inconsistency explored. The process was meticulous, sometimes frustrating, but it maintained the integrity of the case and ensured that any resulting legal action would be grounded in irrefutable evidence. By 2010, the cold case had fully re-entered active investigation status. The Boise Police Department assembled a dedicated task force, combining veteran detectives familiar with the historical case files with newer officers trained in modern investigative techniques. Together, they reviewed every document, searched for overlooked patterns, and coordinated with state and federal databases. It was a blend of old and new, decades of painstaking documentation meeting contemporary forensic science, a union that would ultimately crack the decades-old mystery. Meanwhile, the Whitmans, now in their 70s, participated in every public update, offering interviews and sharing their enduring hope for closure. Their persistence, coupled with community vigilance, ensured that the case remained visible and that the eventual resolution would carry the weight of public attention and moral significance. Every file, every DNA sample, every archival note had been preserved with faith in justice that endured longer than the passage of time. By the mid-2010s, investigators had accumulated enough new evidence to narrow potential suspects. DNA evidence, matched against historical records and modern criminal databases, pointed clearly toward one individual, a man who had lived in Boise at the time of Claire's disappearance and whose background revealed patterns consistent with the crime. The once cold trail, long buried under decades of frustration, false leads, and missed opportunities, finally led directly to a person who could be held accountable. The case had transformed over 40 years, from frantic searches and community mobilization to decades of patient preservation and forensic innovation. What had once seemed lost, impossible, and unattainable now shimmered on the horizon of possibility. The cold case phase had not erased hope. Rather, it had strengthened the foundation for the breakthrough that would soon shake the community and finally provide the Whitman family with long-awaited answers. The breakthrough came quietly, almost imperceptibly, as breakthroughs often do in decades-old cold cases. In 2016, forensic analysts confirmed a DNA match between the hair sample collected near Claire Whitman's last known route and a man with a criminal record whose name had been in law enforcement files for years but never linked to her disappearance. The revelation sent ripples through the Boise Police Department. Detectives who had dedicated months to reviewing the case suddenly had a tangible lead, a living person to investigate, someone who could finally answer the decades-old questions that had haunted both the Whitman family and the community. The suspect, George Harwood, was a quiet man in his 60s, living alone in a small home near the outskirts town. At the time of Claire's disappearance, he had worked intermittently as a mechanic and handyman, a familiar figure in Boise's neighborhoods, but one whose behavior had never attracted serious scrutiny. His records revealed a pattern of petty crimes and suspicious activity, but nothing that had tied him to a disappearance or violent act. Now, armed with DNA evidence and detailed investigative records, Officers Green and Marlowe's successors prepared for a confrontation that had waited more than 40 years. The arrest was carefully orchestrated. Boise law enforcement, working with state and federal agents, approached Harwood's residence at dawn, aiming to prevent flight or resistance. Uniformed officers surrounded the modest home, flashlights cutting through the early morning shadows. Neighbors, accustomed to quiet streets, peeked through curtains, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Inside, Harwood was taken into custody without incident, his demeanor calm but tense, as if he understood the gravity of the moment even before officers read him his rights. During questioning, investigators were methodical, presenting evidence with patience and precision. Harwood initially denied any involvement, claiming he'd been elsewhere on the day of Claire's disappearance. But DNA, combined with meticulous cross-referencing of timelines and witness statements, left little room for evasion. Investigators confronted him with each piece of evidence: the DNA match, his proximity to Claire's route, and a series of minor but suspicious behaviors documented decades earlier. Slowly, the cracks appeared. Under intense questioning and the weight of incontrovertible evidence, Harwood eventually confessed, recounting in chilling detail what happened on May 12, 1973. The confession was disturbing in its simplicity. Harwood admitted to following Claire along her usual bicycle route, identifying her as vulnerable and alone. He described the abduction, the concealment, and the grim steps he had taken to ensure that no immediate discovery would be possible. Law enforcement documented every word, recording the account for both evidentiary purposes and historical record. While Harwood's motivations were selfish and cruel, the confession provided the clarity and closure that had eluded investigators and the Whitman family for decades. Boise, a city that had aged alongside the case, reacted with a mixture of relief and shock. News of the arrest and confession spread quickly, dominating headlines, radio, and television broadcasts. Boise cold case solved after 43 years, read one front-page banner. DNA breakthrough leads to arrest in 1973 abduction, blared another. Residents who had lived with decades of uncertainty felt a profound mixture of emotions. Vindication that justice was finally being served. Sorrow for the girl who had suffered, and awe at the persistence of law enforcement and forensic science. The Whitman family's response was complex and deeply human. Ellen Whitman, now in her 70s, allowed herself both tears of grief and tears of relief. "It's been a lifetime waiting," she said in an interview, her voice trembling. "We finally have answers. That doesn't undo what happened, but it gives Claire back to us in some way. We know now. We can grieve, and we can remember her properly." Robert Whitman, equally weathered by decades of hope and despair, expressed gratitude toward law enforcement. "The detectives, past and present, never gave up," he said. "Every note, every record, every search, they made this possible. Justice doesn't erase pain, but it honors it." The trial, when it came, was swift compared to the decades-long wait. Harwood's confession, corroborated by DNA evidence, historical records, and witness statements, left little room for dispute. The proceedings were tense, emotional, and closely followed by the media and the community. Testimonies recounted both the events of that long-ago day and the decades of impact on Claire's family and the city. The jury's verdict was unequivocal. Guilty. Harwood received a sentence commensurate with the crime, a measure of justice that, while delayed, affirmed the moral and legal responsibility for decades of suffering. In Boise, the arrest became a defining moment. It was a testament to the persistence of law enforcement, the evolution of forensic science, and the dedication of family unwilling to let their daughter's story fade into silence. Residents reflected on the decades of anxiety, vigilance, and hope, realizing that the collective memory of community could preserve the past long enough for truth to emerge. The trial, when it came, was swift compared to the decades-long wait. Harwood's confession, corroborated by DNA evidence, historical records, and witness statements left little room for dispute. The proceedings were tense, emotional, and closely followed by the media and the community. Testimonies recounted both the events of that long-ago day and the decades of impact on Claire's family and the city. The jury's verdict was unequivocal: guilty. Harwood received a sentence commensurate with the crime, a measure of justice that, while delayed, affirmed the moral and legal responsibility for decades of suffering. In Boise, the arrest became a defining moment. It was a testament to the persistence of law enforcement, the evolution of forensic science, and the dedication of family unwilling to let their daughter's story fade into silence. Residents reflected on the decades of anxiety, vigilance, and hope, realizing that the collective memory of a community could preserve the past long enough for truth to emerge. Local historians and journalists documented the case extensively, ensuring that future generations would understand not only the crime itself, but also the societal, technological, and emotional currents that had allowed justice to finally prevail. By the time the trial concluded, more than 43 years had passed since Claire Whitman disappeared. Her story had been woven into the fabric of Boise, a cautionary tale, a memorial, and ultimately, a narrative of persistence, hope, and eventual resolution. The arrest of George Harwood was shocking precisely because of the passage of time, the decades in which his actions went undetected, the years in which a community carried the weight of uncertainty, and the remarkable convergence of technology and diligence that finally exposed the truth. The breakthrough was more than a resolution of a single case. It was a statement that even when the trail goes cold, when years pass without answers, the meticulous preservation of evidence and relentless pursuit of justice can triumph over time itself. It was proof that victims could be honored, families could find closure, and communities could reclaim a sense of moral order, even after decades of fear, uncertainty, and unanswered questions. And as the sun set over Boise on the day of the arrest, casting long shadows across the streets and orchards where Claire had once ridden freely, the city felt a rare sense of closure. Justice had been delayed but not denied, and the truth, long buried beneath the weight of years, had finally emerged. The arrest was more than a legal action. It was a moment of catharsis, a turning point that allowed grief, hope, and resolution to coexist in the same space, providing a measure of peace to those who had waited a lifetime for answers. The aftermath of the arrest was quiet, but profound. Boise, a city that had once been defined by routine and familiarity, had been irrevocably marked by the disappearance of Claire Whitman. Even decades later, residents recalled the anxious mornings, the long volunteer searches, and the tense anticipation of every media update. But with the resolution, those memories transformed from fear into reflection, a reminder of the fragility of safety, the endurance of hope, and the capacity of community to carry the weight of tragedy together. For the Whitman family, the years of waiting had left invisible scars, but the clarity finally allowed them to grieve fully and honestly. Ellen Whitman spoke often of the relief in knowing what had happened, even if it could not undo the harm. "We lived in a shadow for so long," she said. "Knowing the truth doesn't bring Claire back, but it lets us honor her, remember her properly, and finally let go of some of the uncertainty that haunted us." Robert Whitman echoed her sentiments, emphasizing the importance of persistence, memory, and faith in justice. "A lifetime of waiting teaches you patience," he said. "It also teaches you that hope, even when it feels faint, can never be abandoned." The case also left an enduring impact on Boise itself. Law enforcement departments updated protocols for missing persons cases, incorporating lessons learned from the challenges and delays in Claire's disappearance. DNA preservation, meticulous record-keeping, and interdepartmental collaboration became cornerstones of future investigations. Officers Green and Marlowe, though retired, were often consulted for historical insight, and their dedication was celebrated as foundational to the eventual resolution. The story of Claire Whitman became part of local lore, a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. Media coverage continued long after the arrest and trial, documenting the journey from disappearance to resolution. Journalists highlighted the combination of old-school detective work, volunteer engagement, and modern forensic science that had finally brought the case to light. Across Boise, newspapers printed stories of remembrance, analysis, and reflection. Interviews with neighbors, former volunteers, and the Whitman family underscored the personal toll and the communal investment in justice. illustrating how a single missing child had shaped the social and emotional landscape of the city for decades. Psychologically, the resolution offered a complex mix of relief and sorrow. Residents who had grown up alongside the story experienced a sense of closure, yet the memory of lost innocence lingered. The arrest of George Harwood, decades after the fact, reminded everyone that justice could be delayed but not denied. It reinforced a belief that persistence, both in legal diligence and in personal resolve, could eventually bridge the gap between tragedy and accountability. The city, once shadowed by uncertainty, could now reconcile with its past in a way that honored both memory and truth. For law enforcement, the Whitman case became a model of endurance and innovation. Younger detectives learned the importance of preserving evidence, even when a case seems hopeless, and of revisiting old leads with fresh eyes and new technology. Analysts highlighted the role of DNA breakthroughs in solving decades-old mysteries, reinforcing the necessity of combining archival diligence with scientific advancement. In essence, the case became a bridge between generations of police work, connecting the intuition and persistence of the past with the analytical rigor of the present. As for the Whitman family, life slowly resumed its rhythms, though forever altered. Ellen returned to painting, inspired by Claire's sketches and the memory of her daughter's laughter. Robert focused on volunteer work, channeling his grief into civic engagement and helping other families affected by loss. Their home, once the epicenter of panic and despair, became a place of quiet remembrance, filled with photographs, sketches, and mementos that kept Claire's presence alive in a positive, honoring way. The community respected this space, visiting occasionally, offering support, and ensuring that the family was never alone in their continued journey of healing. In reflection, the case of Claire Whitman stood as a testament to the power of patience, diligence, and community. Justice had not been swift. It had not been immediate. It had waited, decades beneath the weight of uncertainty, false leads, and the erosion of memory. But it had come, and in its arrival, it reminded everyone involved that truth, once unearthed, could transform grief into understanding, fear into reflection, and despair into a long-awaited measure of peace. And as the Whitman family sat together in the evening light, looking at a photograph of Claire smiling on her bicycle, they felt the presence of their daughter in a way they hadn't for decades. Not as a missing child, not as an unresolved shadow of tragedy, but as a life remembered, a story told, and a truth finally revealed. Justice, long delayed, had arrived,